Welcome, and I trust 2025 is going to be a great year for you. And here we are again with another episode of the Southern African Institute of Government Auditors, where we discuss the professional, the ethical, the accountability elements of your profession. And the whole idea behind these podcasts is to update you on the developments in the profession, as well as share with you information about the events that are coming up. And this time around, we're going to discuss the let's call them Global Internal Audit standards. And these are standards that are compiled over a period of time. And I'm with Lusanda Ncoliwe, who is with PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, I think it's what it's called now. And she's going to talk to us about the import, the meaning of these Global Internal Audit standards, how they were compiled, what we need to pay attention to, etc., etc. And compliments of the new year to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Tim.
A pleasure to have you with us here. Now, just give me a brief background of these Global Internal Audit standards. What are they all about, and how long did they take to compile them?
Sure. Good afternoon or good morning to all your guests. So the Global Internal Audit standards, in essence, are standards that are used by internal auditors all over the world to do the work that they do.
Mm-hmm.
The latest version, which we call the 2024 Global Internal Standards, were issued on the 9th of January 2024, and they had taken a period of 2 years to compile. And that compilation consisted of people from all over the world being involved. First, what we call the Global Institute of Internal Auditors and the working group started working on them. And then from the working group, we had a period where practitioners or internal auditors from all over the world had 3 months to comment on the draft, which South Africa gave also an input and also an Africa input on what the draft was like. And that happened in 2023 between March and June. And then between June and December, that working group took those comments into account. And on the 9th of January 2024, we had standards effectively now published.
Mm-hmm. So how important is this report? I mean, what's the point of it? Much as, it's to update all the professionals around the world. But just from a South African perspective, what is the purpose?
Sure. The one thing to appreciate is that internal audit as a profession, the unique thing about it is that practitioners all over the world use the same standard, which is not always true for all professions. So, for example, in external audit, if you qualify in South Africa, you need to convert if you want to move to Australia or any other country. Internal auditors are very unique in the manner that we write the same exams all over the world. We use the same standards all over the world. Now, the version that is the latest version, which was published last year, but was only effective in 9th of January in 2025. The importance is that we've streamlined many things in those standards, which is those standards now are divided in just to 5 areas. And those 5 areas are very clear for practitioners. So there's an area specific to governance, which talks to the boards of entities and the way in which they deal with us as internal auditors. There's a section which is made for managing internal audit, which is anyone who's a manager, a chief audit executive will use that particular domain to be able to see what is guided there. And then there's one for practitioners. So if you're just out of school, you're a practitioner, you're not a manager, there's a specific domain for you that actually tells you what you need to do as an internal auditor. The most important thing really about this is the fact that, the standards themselves give you a set of rules that you can follow as internal auditor, so that even the companies that you work in or the ones that you service, there's a specific set of rules they can hold you to, because these standards are actually a set of rules in the way we behave, because there's a code of ethics there, in the way we deal with our clients, and so on and so forth. So that's why these standards are important right? I will go maybe in detail later about what is the importance of these standards to government or government institutions themselves, because it's something very unique. It's a latest version. It's the first time that we had something specifically on government.
Well, let's talk about or focus a bit on one domain, that of ethics and professionalism. Tell me more about it.
Sure. So I think the most important thing is that this particular domain, it talks about the code of conduct, right? And that code of conduct really emphasizes, how an internal auditor needs to act. What are the ethical dimensions one need to have, and not just know, but make sure that each and every year you update, training on ethics. Because as you can imagine, if you are a business and you've got internal auditors, you want someone who's ethical to be able to be looking at your books. You want someone who's ethical who will be looking at the controls. You want someone ethical to be able to be what you call a trusted advisor, because, by the way, the pinnacle of being an internal auditor is to be known as a trusted advisor. So to get someone to trust you enough to call you that, for sure you have to be ethical. So the standards themselves also prescribe to say, you don't just learn this once and you forget about it in 20 years. Every year you need to have training on ethics so that you remember, because they form the very core of being an internal auditor.
Right, let's take another step back, or maybe move to another area of focus of these standards, and that's the governing the internal audit. There are specific ideas and rules there. Tell me more.
Sure. So this particular domain, I think I mentioned that there's 5 areas, or what we call them as domain. This one is called the governance domain, right? And its importance is that it details our relationship with the board, or the entity that is overseeing the whole company that you are in. So in some instances, it's a board. If you're in a municipality, it will be a council, etc., etc. So it governs our relationship as internal auditors between ourselves and the overarching governing structure. The second thing about it is that in that particular governance domain, it talks about other elements which are quite important. That is, if you are what we call a chief audit executive or head of internal audit, it tells you about some of the things that you need to do as a minimum requirement. One of them, which is something that is quite important, that has come as a very important element of these standards, is that your strategy of the internal audit function. And it talks about the fact that as an internal audit department, your strategy needs to, 1, be approved by the audit committee or the board. But most importantly, your strategy has to be aligned with the strategy of the entity where you work. The direction of the company where you work or the company that you service, you have to be conscious that your strategy is not going left while the company itself is going right. Another element which is also found in this domain, which I would highlight because it's a new element, is what we call the internal audit mandate. Right. And the reasoning behind this internal audit mandate, which has really been highlighted in these standards, is that often when something goes wrong, you would have heard, team, in any area where something goes wrong, someone always asks, where were the auditors? Now, this particular area, which is called the mandate, is really meant to be able to close that expectation gap. And you are required that the audit committee, the board, the council, must be able, through the mandate, to document the things that you expect from internal audit department. And then the internal audit department knows these are the things which are expected from us. You can appreciate that if you have written the expectations from an internal audit department, then it closes the expectation gap where you say, I thought you will do this as internal audit, or I was expecting you to do this as internal audit. You are now clear on the things which are expected from you.
So it promotes the accountability element.
For sure.
And clarifies whatever needs to be clarified.
Definitely clarifies what is expected. Accountability is enhanced for sure.
But now there's another area which sometimes I suppose we can conflate the two, the governance element and the management element of internal audit. But it's a separate domain altogether, managing internal audit.
Definitely.
Tell me more about it. How different is it?
So the domain about managing internal audit, the way I see it is that this is a domain now meant for managers in the sphere of internal audit. So as you can appreciate that any entity will have the board, it will have the executives, it will have the middle management, and then it will have the employees. So in simple terms, this is what the managers level, this is where the domain is specific for them. To say, if I have a group of 15 internal auditors, how exactly do I manage them? And it talks to things like, how one would plan, the plan for the year, how one will plan the resources, which is, I've got 15 people and we have to do 30 things. How do I plan, those kind of things in terms of timing, in terms of teams that I put together, etc., etc. So as I said, the way I see it is that these new standards have simplified to say, if I'm at this level, or if I'm a manager, this is where I'm given guidance in terms of doing my work. And if I'm an internal auditor, this is where I'm given guidance, etc. So it's clarified those roles for each person, and a person can simply go straight to the domain that is relevant to them at the particular time.
And does it say anything about quality control?
For sure. So essentially, one of the things that we pride ourselves as internal auditors is that, you do not just give a service to a client or be an auditor of a company that you are work in, but you're not accountable in the work that you do, right? The very essence of these standards actually give you, things that you should be doing, or it give you guidance of what you must do. So the standards really, the old version of the standards prescribed that you'd have an independent quality assurance once every 5 years, right? But over and above that, it talked about something very important to say, between the 5 years, you have to have a continuous improvement program. So a continuous quality improvement program, which makes sure that the service that you give to the client, the service that you give to the entity that you work with, it's a quality service. The new element that has come with the new version of the standards is that in that quality assurance process, at least one person in that particular team has to be a qualified, certified internal auditor. Now, a certified internal auditor is a qualification that is common all over the world. In fact, it's the pinnacle of being an internal auditor. If you are an internal auditor all over the world, the pinnacle qualification that is recognized by the Institute of Internal Auditors is a certified internal auditor. So these standards are very clear that a member of that quality assurance team has to be a CIA, or what we call a certified internal auditor. It is very important as an internal auditor that the quality of work that you do has to be maintained in a certain standards. And therefore, this quality assurance or continued quality assurance has to be done by any internal audit function. And the pinnacle of that is that you are doing it as you go along all year round, but after every 5 years, you will get someone independent of your team to come and now verify that you are meeting the quality standards of these global standards.
Now, there are also standards that are focused on the performance of these services. If you could discuss a few of those things, in other words, those who are not necessarily responsible for leading groups of people or setting up mandates and so on. Can you share with us some of those standards?
So that is domain number 5, and then domain number 5 is really focused on someone who's an executor, the soldier on the ground, and it talks to areas of importance to say how do you make sure that when you are auditing, you plan well as an executor. How do you? What is required of your working papers, for example? Because as auditors, by the way, we document everything we do. what are the minimum requirements that you need to write down there, so that one can see that the supporting information that you've collected have led you to the opinion that you've given at the end of the day. So if you say someone's control environment is not working, one is able to say you had evidence, you collected adequate evidence, and this evidence has led you to this opinion. Another very important element that it talks about in this domain 5, which is a domain for executors, is communication, you see. So it talks about the way you communicate to the people that you audit, the way you communicate the outcomes of your audit, the way you communicate to any other stakeholders who will get these outcomes of your audit. So this one is really an important one because it talks to the day-to-day. The auditor who is working day in, day out, auditing. This is a domain for them. It's specifically called Domain 5.
Now, all of these things would apply, these standards, whether you're in the private sector or in the public sector. But the new report also emphasizes a particular approach when it comes to the government or public sector. And you said you wanted to talk extensively about it. How are these standards going to apply in the context of government and public sector? And are there areas that you believe need to be highlighted for particularly those who work and operate in that space?
Sure. So I think the important part that has come through is that the standards have recognized that it's not as size one fits all in terms of standards themselves, right? And the one thing that's specifically mentioned to say, why was there a public sector, what we call supplement, right? Which just talks to public sector. It talks to the fact that, the standards did recognize the fact that public sector is financed in a different manner. So the way in which, if you're a municipality or a department, etc., you get your money is different from any other entity. Secondly, the one thing which was specifically mentioned was to also recognize the fact that when you are in public sector, the legislation that is applicable to public sector is different. So in the South African context, the thing that is very familiar is that if you are a government department, we've got what we call a PFMA, and PMFA is really, really very specific, including the way you procure, the way you pay your expenses, e.g., you must pay them within 30 days, etc. So it's very prescriptive, right? So is the legislation for municipalities very prescriptive in the way you need to do things, right? So what the standards have done is that, as you can appreciate, is that if you have a set of rules, and those set of rules are global rules, right? The pros are that everybody uses uniform rules, but the cons are that regions have got specific laws, right? So for the very first time in the history of the standards, now that was the recognition to say there need to be a supplement that talks specifically to public sector, so that it can take into account of these two things that they have mentioned. And these two things are funding related to public sector and also specific acts. If you look at something like preferential procurement doesn't affect private sector, but it does affect public sector. And therefore, these standards are taking those things into account to say, this will not fit specifically to public sector, and therefore we need to put together a supplement to take into account these nuances for public sector.
Now, we've spoken extensively about the internal audit functions, the governance, the management, and all of those issues.
Sure.
Are there any particular issues that need to be highlighted when it comes to external auditors, or how internal auditors work with external auditors?
Sure. I think one of the other elements or highlights of these standards, right, is that we talk about what we call coordinated assurance, and that simply means that as internal auditors, we do not work on our own, but we work with in conjunction with other assurers, which is the external auditors and all other assurers that we come across, second line of service. So it will be risk management, etc., right? I think the important thing, though, is that because the standards have got a specific area that talks about coordinated assurance, external auditors can take that as a big positive, because at the end of the day, if you are sitting in any entity, you want to make sure that the whole company has got full suite of assurance. And that full suite of assurance means that all the assurers have to be working together. Nothing falls in between and nothing is duplicated. And because now of this recognition of having what we call coordination between these assurers, it means that as an external auditor, you can now have more confidence in relying on the work of internal auditors. So that is very important, because otherwise, if you are sitting in an entity and external audit is doing their own thing, internal audit is doing one thing, compliance, etc., these people, if they're not working together, then you are not getting the best value as a client, you're not getting the best value as an entity, etc. And the fact that that has had a specific recognition in these standards, I think, is going to make the life of an external auditor much easier. I mean, I don't want to be too technical, but basically, if you're an external auditor, right, one of the first things that you do that determines how much work you are going to do is to get an opinion on the control environment. And you're looking at controls. And those controls that I'm talking about is the very work that internal auditors do. Now, if you can get trust between yourself and internal audit, it means you do less work. So the term that we use is that the substantive testing itself depends on how strong one's environment is, and working together and being able to get an opinion that you trust from internal auditors means there's less substantive work that you will do as an external auditor, because once an external auditor assures and gives you that, the control environment is strong, it means you do less work. But the opposite is true. If the internal auditors go and audit an area and say this control environment is not working, then you already know as external auditor what you need to do. You need to do more substantive work.
Lusanda Ncoliwe, thanks very much for talking to us. And of course, this is very important, I suppose, for internal auditors in particular to grab hold of this report of the Global Internal Auditor Standards, familiarize themselves with that, and we appreciate your input. Lusanda is the Partner Risk Assurance at PwC. She's also the Deputy Board Chairperson at IIA South Africa. We appreciate your inputs, much appreciated.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for watching this episode where we were talking about the Global Internal Audit Standards with the chairperson of the South African Institute of Internal Auditors, Lusanda Ncoliwe. She's also partner of risk assurance at PwC. Until next time, goodbye to you.